Landscape Management and Decision Support R&D section up in Armidale. And I'd just like to acknowledge the contribution of my colleagues, and also in the project we were working on within the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative. We worked a lot with NGO groups like Osgreen, and also Hunter Central Rivers CMA, and some behavioural, animal behavioural scientists from CSIRO. So they've all contributed to help with the analysis and the approach. What I'd like to start off before I actually go into the project and the science behind it and the modelling is just to reflect on some of the key learnings, I suppose, from this experience, and from a lot of my dealings in conservation planning projects. And I've found that you can have the best science in the world, and Australia leads in conservation planning science, but without some of these other components, often projects aren't successful. And they include things like having clear objectives at the beginning of a conservation planning project. And another one which I think is really important, and I'll be touching on ways we did this, is good communication of science and communication of the objectives to all of those involved, and having a shared decision-making process with partnership with the local stakeholders. So the focus of these projects was conservation on private land. So we have to win over hearts and minds of private landholders, and I think that's going to be still critically important because TSRs and public land it's got to be considered in the landscape context. As Pia was saying, that the intensity of the land use around had a big impact on those TSRs. Also, use of local knowledge. We often sit in our computers and do desktop analysis and say there's the answer. But we found that use of especially Central Rivers, the CMA staff, incredibly amazing knowledge of the local area. And lastly, I'm not a big fan of optimisations, and I think the best approach, from my experience, is one called informed opportunism. This is where you get all your proposals come in from the public, and you filter and select those based on what your information or your conservation planning is telling you. Because when it comes down to it, it's all voluntary. We can't force anyone to invest in conservation. So just quickly, a background. The Great Eastern Ranges, if you haven't heard of it, is an initiative to enhance the biodiversity values of the corridor between Victoria right up to North Queensland along the Great Escarpment and the Great Divide. There's a good chance when Victoria signs up it'll go all the way to the Grampians. So it'll be a very large continental scale vision for a connected landscape. But the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative is as much about connecting people who work in this field as it is about connecting habitat. And the Great Eastern Ranges initiated a partnership in the Hunter region. This was identified as a bit of a gap in the continuous vegetation, especially in forests. Even though in some areas it's a natural gap where the original veg would have been woodlands. But there was a process of holding a lot of workshops and meetings with and identifying the regional stakeholders that were involved. And from all of the stakeholders, the smallest key stakeholders were made up a steering committee to help us do the planning. Because we were starting with a clean slate. There had been no conservation planning analysis in the Hunter region, and we didn't even have a veg map. So they identified the first step was to do whole of catchment scale analysis to work out where they should focus their effort. So they came up with this objective, which is common for a lot of these initiatives, which was to increase the resilience, extent and connectivity of native ecosystems. And I was given that and said, to go away and produce a map for them to help them make decisions. But to do that, I had to make those, to get practical definitions from that objective that would allow me to do the modelling. So we use this simple sort of logic, I suppose, that ecosystems, and Veronica and Eric Dorr from CSIRO helped develop this logic. Ecosystems are made up of species populations. Populations, therefore, therefore resilient ecosystems will depend on the resilience of the populations of species. And especially resilient animal populations are often used as a surrogate of healthy, functional ecosystems. And the other advantage is everybody can have empathy for animals, and they're a good flagship for selling conservation. They're cute and cuddly and emotive. So the task of communicating this to non-scientists, lay people, was I saw as important to bring them along with us in the decision making. So this is a very simple story, if you like, that we used to sell this message, and as well as the science, to lay people, and that is to say that animals, wild animals and native animals, are just like us. After all, we are animals. We need shelter, we need food, we need to find mate, we need to successfully rear our kids, and to do all this, the native fauna need habitat and connectivity, and these are things that we can model to help us guide decision making. So these are just some quick pictorial examples of shelter. So we have houses. Animals obviously have their own houses and needs for shelter. We need food, and so do animals need a source of food. There's a powerful owl eating a possum. So probably not such a good example. But we also need to find a mate. That's an example of speed dating. It's probably like an extreme example. We need to, and obviously to rear our kids, and that's a picture of the royal family, so maybe not a good example. In the case of just choosing a different message depending on your audience, my kids relate to this much more than the royal family. And so for all this, to do this, they need habitat and connectivity. And for us, our habitat is our suburbs and houses, and simplistically, connectivity to the local supermarket is via a car normally, or a bike, via roads. So this is just a story that people can relate to and understand. And obviously animals have a different requirements for their houses and connectivity in the landscape. So getting back to the science, we came up with two criteria to guide our analysis, and this was assisted from Veronica and Eric Dorr as well. We needed enough suitable habitat to support subpopulations of animals. So, and this is where that can be broken down into the right type of habitat, such as wet sclerophyll versus woodlands, the sufficient habitat accessible to the animals to provide their resources and provide food and shelter. And that's where condition and studies like Pia's have shown that condition is critically important. We also, in fragmented landscapes, we need connections between subpopulations for genetic flow to improve resilience. And so we need structural and functional connectivity between these habitat patches. And what I think is a landmark review of all the literature was undertaken by Veronica and Eric Dorr and CSIRO, where they looked at all the available studies into functional connectivity by fauna. Most of the studies were birds and mammals, and there's a big gap in terms of reptiles and invertebrates, etc. But what they found out interestingly was that on average, a lot of them had similar requirements, and obviously this will vary, but they found some very common thresholds, and they were the areas of patches of 10 hectares or more likely to support subpopulations. They found that the gaps between stepping stones had to be less than 100 metres for them to be used on average. And interestingly, looking at foraging behaviour, especially with birds, they wouldn't travel more than 1.5 kilometres, even if there was stepping stones. So this is really useful information for us modellers, so we can build into our models to create more realistic models of habitat requirements.